Since its 2014 release, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has done one thing significantly better than all of the previous editions of D&D, and that's creating these big, epic adventure books. I have to say that before 5e, I never really ran pre-written adventures, and if I did, it was probably just a one-shot from a third-party company or something. However, I've had a few people now ask me for just some tips and advice for running their group through these really large, epic stories and how to best tackle reading through so much material and handling all that. And well, as a matter of fact, I do have some things that have helped me when diving into these large stories and how I approach customizing them for each of my different player groups. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. These are just some pretty easy rules of thumb that I like to use when jumping in to one of these large pre-written adventure campaigns. The first and best bit of advice I have is don't read the whole damn book when you get it. This is a terrible way to prep for the adventure. For one, you're not going to retain really much of anything useful. And two, it's just not a good way to spend your limited prep time. Look guys, even if you're running an adventure that you've created yourself, you don't want to be prepping more than a session or a session and a half worth of material anyway. Trying to prep for even just 3 or 4 sessions out is not really what we want to do. Make whatever analogy you want. A jack of all trades is a master of none. You're like jam spread too thinly over too much toast. You're just not going to execute your next session well if the last thing you did in your DM prep is work on the 4th session out from that day's session. Don't try and read the whole book. Skim through and flip through the pages instead. Look at the chapter names. Glance over the appendices and see what kinds of magic items, MacGuffins, and new stat blocks are in the back of the campaign. But don't read the whole book. Instead, focus on how it starts. Read as much of that first chapter as you can. Often these will throw 10,000 names at you, and you may be tempted to flip back and forth looking up what each of these individual characters do and who they are. But try to keep reading through the intro and cut through the distractions. Focus on those first few moments of the campaign. How will the players be introduced? How will they get to this location? What is the call to action here? Does it need to be punched up or adapted at all for my individual party? These questions revolving around that first session are your first and most important task, and that is where you should start. Okay, tip number 3 is to learn the villains. As you grow and evolve as a dungeon master, you will spend less time reading what the non-player characters do and what room they stand in a dungeon, and focus more on understanding the villains. Again, to coin a little phrase for you guys, you don't need to learn where the villain stands. You need to understand the villain. Learn what the villain wants. Think about how they're going to react to and treat the players. Are they going to underestimate them? Or are they going to study their every move? Are your villains going to take them so seriously that they are scrying on them from afar? Who else will the villain use to achieve their goals, and what are they capable of doing? Does the villain have enemies? Do they have allies? Understand the campaign villain, and no matter how far off book the players get, you'll be able to pick the villain and plot back up and place it right in front of them. Tip number 4 is to locate the MacGuffins. If the book sends the players off to retrieve a conch, a book, a sword, a NPC, or a purple worm egg, all you need to know is exactly where those things are. Often the book buries this information, and it's rather annoying. If you use D&D Beyond, by the way, Control+F is a very good friend I have found. Otherwise, scan through the book and find out where these items specifically are. You might get info from the book that the book that they need to find is on the island. And that's great, but where? What room? Learn this and you'll feel far more prepared, trust me. Tip number 5 is to look for places throughout your campaign where you can include player backstories. Sometimes you will have room all over the place. Storm King's Thunder was a great example of that due to how spread out that whole campaign is. Out of the Abyss, taking place in the Underdark, much less so. But it's your job to keep an eye peeled for character backstory. If you see an opening, take advantage of it. Just because there are spots at the beginning of a campaign for multiple side quests, for example, that doesn't mean that that kind of room will continue throughout the campaign. So jump on them when you see them. Tip number 6 is to cut. Listen, as a YouTuber, one of the hardest things you have to learn in content creation is how to take something that might be good even and still cut it and get rid of it because of pacing or length. The same rule applies to these campaign adventures. Just because it's in the book doesn't mean you and your players have to do it. Just as an example of this, and trying to be as vague as possible here for spoilers, in one of the campaigns, there was an entire dream sequence chapter. I just ignored it. The players didn't even know I cut out an entire chapter of the adventure. The pace towards the end of this adventure with the climax kept up well, and we had a terrific end to the campaign instead. Also, by cutting content like this, it has the added benefit of creating space, that space we talked about, for personal quests and character development. So cut a lot of stuff. And speaking of cutting content, tip number 7 is to ignore random encounters. Look, you can still read them. You can even use a few if you want. But you don't have to have a gnoll band attack the party every single time they move from town to town. In fact, if the party is hooked into the story and they are eagerly trying to follow the plot to that next plot line, the worst thing you can do is just stop all the momentum you have and have them roll and fight another set of hook horrors. Wizards of the Coast has a really bad habit of filling content and empty spaces with random encounter tables in these books. And I mean, to be fair, Paizo does the same thing, but you should definitely ignore them. You know, unless one of the encounters inspires you or something, then great, use it. Speaking of ignoring things, tip number 8 is to ignore the level recommendations. The level recommendations in these books are there to make it so that a bunch of new players, a bunch of newbies, can beat the campaign. I mean that. If Wizards made a bunch of campaigns too hard for new players to beat, new players would die and get discouraged and stop playing and thus stop buying. That, of course, is bad for business. So Wizards has these very mediocre and very beatable enemies and nice little level guides for Dungeon Masters to level up their group before trekking into a new chapter or area. You can certainly wait a bit, or punch up your encounters, or both if you want, or even level up your group faster and just add some more enemies to the fights. But don't worry too hard about trying to stick to the level recommendations in all of these campaign guides. It's not a big deal. Tip number 9 is to punch up single enemy combats. Many of these campaigns were written years ago before Tasha's was released and raised the power level for player groups. You don't have to rework every encounter, but I have found that a very few single enemy fights in any of these campaigns that players don't just breeze right through. Some even after I maxed the enemy's health and added a few extra little minions to help the encounter. So I would absolutely look at any and all of these big boss fights and just add to them a teeny bit. Okay, you're not looking for a TPK, right? But even if your party favors roleplay over combat, you don't want these big fights to feel massively anticlimactic. And finally, tip number 10 is to look for villains. Here's a little secret. Sometimes I make someone a villain that I had no intention of being a major antagonist to the PCs. Why? Because I'm reading the players at the table and reading their reactions to these NPCs. I might bully them with 3 straight NPCs to try and indenture the players into serving them or achieving a task for them. But if the players had a much more adverse reaction to the second of the 3, that's my clue to use that NPC to build natural villains. So be on the lookout for these naturally occurring villains in these campaigns. Instead of forcing the players to focus on whatever villain they're supposed to stop written down in this book, turn and twist someone that they already dislike and promote them to a reoccurring character. Hell, in one adventure, the players killed the final boss in the book and did not care at all, because I had already set up a final showdown with one little nobody's Zentarum agent from Goldenfields instead. They'd already killed the villain, and when they finally got this horrible little character, they all physically stood up and cheered. And that's because the payoff was built naturally. Instead of forcing the book villain down their throat, this is the bad guy, so you're supposed to hate them. So always be looking for villains. All right, guys, so there's the tips that I have for you and the things that I like to do when running these pre-written adventure campaigns or campaign books or adventure books or whatever you guys like to call them at your table. What do you guys do? Do you guys have any tips for tackling these things? Do you love these things? Do you hate them? What's your favorite adventure down below? Leave me a comment. What's your favorite one? Leave me a comment with the one you hated the most, or if you guys loved them all. I'd love to read that stuff. I'm taking that information in for a future video, so please do leave me a comment down below with that info. I want to give a massive thank you to all the incredible patrons over at welcomeadventures.com. Guys, thank you so much. It's because of you that I get to keep doing this. And so for that, I'm really, really grateful. Thank you. If you guys like what I do here, you want to support more content like this, welcomeadventures.com is a great way to snag some rewards and do just that. If this is your first time here and you love role-playing games as much as I do, I'd love to have you subscribe. I put out videos on GM tips, player tips, tutorials, and more stuff just like this. So if it sounds like something you might be interested in, just hit the subscribe button down below, right about there or so, and come join us. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Cody, and may your games be filled with awesome memories and even better friends. I'll catch you guys next time.